I guess the Australia was to them just an economic zone. It was a place where you could raise sheep, wheat, and sugarcane, make good money, and go take your money back home to England and have a good time. Charles Pearson writes in National Life and Character in 1893, "The fear of Chinese immigration, which the Australian democracy cherishes, and which the Englishmen at home find hard to understand, is, in fact, the instinct of self-preservation, quickened by experience. We know that coloured and white labour cannot exist side by side. We are well aware that China can swamp us with a single year's surplus of population, and we know that if national existence is sacrificed to the working of a few mines and sugar plantations, it's not the Englishmen and Australia alone, but the whole civilized world that will be the losers." In a similar stead, Teddy Roosevelt, the American president, did a review of Pearson's work, and he also formed the view that not only the United States but Australia were both subject to international finance oligarchs, that these English, usually residing in England, persons of financial means were using our countries to make money, and slavery in the south of the United States was a product of that process. In the same way, in Australia, the importation of Chinese was used heavily. So back in the 19th century, there was a lot of cases like that. So one instance, in the town of Clunes in Victoria, there was a gold mine there that was, it was making money. There was no issues. It was a commercially viable operation. However, the shareholders decided that they wanted to pay less for labour, and so they actually brought in 3 or 4 horse carriages full of Chinese labourers and intended to sack all of the Australian and European descent miners from the gold mine. And this town of Clunes, the entire town, men, women and children, physically mobilised themselves with weapons and blockaded the roads coming into the town. So the horses that were drawing these Chinese scabs, as we would call them, non-unionised labourers, these Chinese scabs were stopped on the road, and they had actually police escort as well. It's a famous story I always make reference to, because the policeman bore his rifle and pointed it at a woman. And the woman picked up a rock and was about to throw it at the policeman and said, "I'd rather be shot than starved." And this was the dire situation that these people in Victoria and people in towns and regions all around Australia faced, that they were looking down the barrel of being completely replaced by Chinese scab labourers who would work for a bowl of rice a day, would not work at European standards of work. They wouldn't work for a fair rate. And this actually, manifested in a whole bunch of events. I won't get into the full detail of all of them, but similar situation in 1878, you had the maritime strike, where basically a large Australasian steam navigation company sacked all of their white sailors and replaced them with Chinese sailors, which resulted in other riots and a strike, which were successful, thank heavens. There was also the blacklegging for Polynesian labourers in Queensland for sugarcane. A lot of people in that time were convinced that white men of European stock could not settle the tropics. I mean, Marcus Clark, Charles Pearson, Teddy Roosevelt, they all kind of subscribed to this concept that warm climates, are unsuitable for people of Northern European stock. So they were bringing in Polynesian labourers to Queensland. During the same time as the gold rush, unsuccessful Chinese miners who didn't find any goods on the gold fields ended up taking over the Victorian manufacturing industries, primarily in furniture. So you had lots of backyard furniture factories that were sweating, 70-hour weeks, undercutting the wages and conditions of Australian labourers in factories in Victoria, which actually resulted in a few riots and some legislation which required all furniture be stamped if it was made by European or Chinese labourers. And all of this kicking off around the 1860s, 1870s, finally culminated in the Great Shearers' Strike in 1891. So William Spence, the founder of the Labor Party, says in his book Australia's Awakening, when they were going to fill white men's places with Chinese and further insisted on freedom of contract, which means non-unionised agreements, shearers and shed hands had no alternative but to go on strike. So 1891 saw, probably the largest industrial action in Australian history, resulting in the army having to be mobilised because there was actual fears of a genuine civil war and a revolutionary army of thousands of shearers armed with rifles taking over the colony of Queensland. So there was a lot of stuff going on just after the gold rush and during the gold rush, which was really testing multiculturalism, the earliest form of it. I mean, principally dealing with Chinese migrants, but it was very clear across the board that, this was detrimental to the national health. There was a lot of labour struggle against it, but there was also liberal thinkers who were uninvolved with the labour movement that were, staunchly in favour of this principle of a white Australia. I mean, Henry Parkes was probably one of the first of those leading men. But in the intercolonial conference of 1888, a lot of colonial parliamentarians had come together to meet, and they all agreed that the further introduction of Chinese to Australia was going to be detrimental to the country. And as you rightfully said, they all tried to legislate to this end, and the Crown refused to give royal assent to them because they at the time had colonised India. They had millions and millions and millions of Indians that were technically British subjects. The Englishmen at home didn't understand the importance of these racial issues because they'd never experienced it. And so they withheld this legislation. So it
the original NIMBY shitlibs.
Yeah, exactly. They just had no idea. Yeah. I mean, Henry Higgins, the High Court Justice and parliamentarian, said that the principle of a white Australia really came about when people had to rub shoulders with foreign labour and compete with them. But the rich people, the people in the agricultural societies and chambers of commerce, they don't understand because they've never had to compete with them. And even better, they profiteer off scab cheap labour from overseas. So it's a fascinating bit of history. I mean, it caused a lot of violence, a lot of grief. A lot of people were displaced. A lot of people lost their work and employment. But it also created this national psyche. It forced these people of different European descent, and even into British cultures. Irish and Welsh and English and Scots. All these people had to unify under a single concept of a white Australia. That's a European descent, Australian ethnic identity, which would repel these cheap foreign invaders. J.F. Archibald, the publisher of the Bulletin, the old newspaper, he's coined as, he's attributed to saying, by the term Australian, we mean not just those who are merely born in Australia, but all white men who come to these shores with a clean record and who leave behind them the memory of class distinction and religious difference in the old world, all men who place the happiness of their adopted land before imperialism are Australians. So you saw this ethnogenesis kicking off around the same time of all these struggles against Chinese labour.
Yeah, and obviously